Welcome to the 21st and very last, at least for a while, Global Guessing Weekly podcast, the podcast on all things forecasting and geopolitics. Don't worry, we're not going anywhere, but after almost a year of global guessing, in fact, as this podcast release, we're just 1 week away from that point, and in the spirit of a good forecaster, it is time for us to reflect on our past and make some improvements for the future. So in this very special episode, Andrew and I will go over why we started this project, recount the content we've produced, highlight our favorite moments, and discuss how our thoughts about quantified forecasting and the content we produce has evolved since our Burkina Faso presidential forecast on November 14th, 2020. At the end of this episode, we'll share with you our exciting plans for 2022 and beyond, so thank you so much for being with us over this past year. But let's get started. Andrew, it's kind of hard to believe it's been a year, huh?
It is extremely hard to believe. November 2020, the world looked a lot different from a geopolitical standpoint, from an economic standpoint. The world was in a very different place. And so it's just been interesting to sort of follow all of the progressions and developments over the last 12 months, especially through the lens of forecasting, which of course has given us a very interesting perspective on both how the world has developed and where it's heading.
Yeah, that was kind of one of the original reasons why we got into this idea of quantified forecasting and starting global guessing, to have this sort of new lens. I'm curious, like, in your eyes, what was the original idea behind global guessing and starting this project?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this a lot with various people that have come on our podcasts. I think it was very serendipitous. You've talked about, suggesting reading super forecasting to me, and I was always interested in going into the geopolitical risk space after college. The writing I was doing was very future focused, and so I think there was sort of a really harmonious sort of like matching there of interests and of approaches. And I think in general, global guessing was meant to just dive deeper into those interests and those focus and to do it in a very public way so that we could get feedback and get input to help us on our own sort of journey of exploring these ideas. And I think, a year in, I think we can call it, a pretty great success.
Yeah, I think also the other thing, at least for me, with having these public forecasts was sort of a way to be held accountable, right? Like, sure, I could privately forecast on a website, but I don't necessarily then have to be public with all of our forecasts, but doing it through global guessing, and I think this might be one of your favorite pieces of content, which we'll get to later, but we'll release forecasts that we end up being wrong about, and that sort of having those things be public, I think made us, or at least for me, the idea was that because they're public, we really have to put in like a lot of good work behind our forecast. Like, we can't be sloppy because here's this public record that we're leaving for our forecasts. And I think in some ways, and I don't think this was like the original idea, but we viewed sort of perceptions of media trust, right? And they're at an all-time low in the US, and I think in some ways, having this sort of public track record for forecasts to me has sort of become almost like a template or model that I think news should adopt, to sort of regain trust. And I'm really glad that we've done it in that way.
Yeah, agreed. And I think there's also an element of accountability that we're holding ourselves to. Like not even to the public, but just when you actually go through the process of spending time writing something and updating it, like it's sort of hard to let things fall by the wayside or to not pay attention because of the effort you're putting into things. So I think on our end as well, starting something like this and making it public made it so that we had to sort of keep up with it and push ourselves in terms of creating content and thinking through forecasts. And I think that was a great exercise in discipline, a great exercise in self-education. And I think those are skills that we'll be able to carry on both through global guessing in the future and also just in our lives outside of this as well.
Yeah, I think it's also been doing something public in a space that like doesn't really have many people in it, right? Like this idea of quantified forecasting has at least been within some sense of like public common knowledge since Tetlock and Gardner's super forecasting came out. But there's not really a lot of people producing content about it. And so by like hopping in this space, it really let us meet these really smart people in the area and talk to people who I don't think otherwise we would have been able to speak with. And I think we've learned a lot about that and learned a lot from those people. And we've really created a lot of content over this last year, haven't we?
It's been a lot. I don't think when you're in it, you don't really see it. But when we were preparing for this podcast and going over all the different podcast episodes that we've done and the different written content that we've done and partnerships with other channels, it has been a very full year. And one thing that I've liked about, just from sort of a macro perspective about our content is that it has been iterative. We haven't sort of started series and it's felt like we have to continue them for the sake of continuing them. We've really, I think, sort of looked at, what is the value being created by certain pieces of content, both for you, the listeners, and also us on the content creation side. And I think we're smart about, which series to sunset, which ones to start, and which ones to invest more into, because it's been a really fun time.
So we have this tally that we created, and I just think it'd be really great for our listeners and just for us to go through just chronologically the series that we've created and how much content for each of those we've done, because it really did blow my mind. Like once we went through this, like just for the record, we've created across the brands associated with global guessing 43 podcasts and I think 34 forecasts about important geopolitical events over the span of 51 weeks, just short of 1 year. We started off doing, as I said at the start, election forecasts, starting off with Burkina Faso. Then we did Niger, Ghana, and Portugal. For me, I think the most interesting takeaway from doing that election series was, first of all, I think it was a pretty good way to get started in this idea of quantified forecasting. There's a lot of literature and sort of examples and models that we could have taken to, make good forecasts about elections. Once we got into things like the Iran nuclear deal, you're really sort of going on your own, and, I think we'll talk about that later. And, there's books out there and different sort of mental models to learn from, but it's a lot more you're on your own. And I think so starting with elections was probably a very smart choice. And then also just, we live in the United States, or we are both American citizens. I'm now in the UK, but we're used to elections being pretty contested and likelihoods being pretty low. And yet, with the exception of Ghana, which was a very close election, and I think I had a lot of fun covering all of the dramatic twists and turns in that one. These elections were, I think, we were like 95% likely, 99. It's really like just different, and I don't know. For me, that like really stood out.
Yeah, I think also, something that we've explored a lot through our podcast and talking to people is that something that can be missing sometimes in the forecasting space is the so what. Like once you've sort of said what the probability of an outcome is, there's very little being done sort of after that, taking it a little bit further. And I think with elections, you're sort of forced to think about what does this mean? Okay, a certain person's going to win an election. What does that mean for the country, for its people, for the country's economy? And so I think starting off in an area that sort of forced us to go that next step with our forecast, I think was a good foundation to set, because I think we really carried that through all of our forecasts. We never really stopped at a percentage. We, I think, always tried to take it a bit further and understand the meaning behind the forecast. And I think that's something that's really benefited us.
So then after elections, we moved over to good old Metaculous Mondays, which was a series that I think once we started Global Guessing was something that we had planned to do, in large part because phenomenal alliteration, incredible. And I think our original name was going to be Metaculous Monday, but because we took so long to release the first piece of content, Scott Alexander ended up releasing his own Metaculous Monday, so we had to pivot to Metaculous Mondays. Since then, he has shifted to Mantic Mondays, obviously because he realizes he can't compete with the Andrew Clay duo in terms of
It's tough.
branding and
It's
getting
tough. I
SEO
can't.
out there, you know?
I don't blame him. I don't blame him.
And I think across, I just was looking on our Metaculous account. We did 18 volumes of Metaculous Mondays and forecasted on 30 questions. I mean, I think for me, Metaculous Mondays was very good to consistently have to forecast, right? Week after week, we either had to make a new forecast or update a forecast, or as we usually did, both. And then also as just like a writing exercise, when I was in graduate school, I had to write essays every single week because my advisor still believed in hard work. But
Do you
once
not
I
believe in
left,
hard work anymore?
well, I'll just say that other advisors did not necessarily impose that same requirement on their students.
Fair enough.
But then once I started my job in the U.S. for when I paused my graduate studies, I didn't really have that sort of writing outlet. And one of the reasons why I was also drawn to this idea of global guessing was sort of this release from our jobs, which were very demanding, and it was great to have this sort of collaborative project with my best friend, and so I really liked, just having to do the writing as well and to make sure I still knew how to write and how to take these forecasts and somehow condense them in a way that was understandable to other people and, sorting out, these very sort of complex ways in which we reach these forecasts and having to distill them down, I think not only was good for writing, but also probably for a forecast as well, right? Knowing that we had to take this thought process and then communicate it to others, I think made our forecast probably more accountable because we had to actually account for every step of our forecast. And I think when you read the comment sections of Metaculous or Good Judgment Open, people will give the rationale, but I don't think they've articulated it to the same degree that we did, in large part because of Metaculous Mondays.
Definitely. I mean, on the job front, totally agree. I'm working mostly in Excel and with numbers, and so being able to write was definitely a nice sort of escape there. Um, and also, yeah, I think we discussed this a few times sort of offline, but when you're breaking down your forecast and explaining the different aspects of your forecast, it makes it easier to talk about with other people. People can critique or give feedback on certain parts of your forecast, the base rate, or how you understood a certain piece of information that you write about. And it just helps for more productive discourse, I think. And I think at least, I don't want to pat ourselves on the back too much, but I didn't see too much of this sort of hybrid forecasting, long form prose on many other platforms. And now, of course, there's the Metaculous Journal, and I think more newsletters are launching, and I think people are sort of seeing the value of that combination of skills and approaches. But
All
I'm
inspired by
really
global
happy
guessing,
with
of
how
course.
we might have had something to do with it, but I'm just glad that we took that approach because I think it really helped with our forecast.
Yeah, and I also thought it made it good for retrospectives, right? Because we clearly laid out our rationale. When we got something wrong, it was really easy to go back and say, oh, either one of our assumptions was wrong or we missed something. I think the one I've always
Mhm.
gone back to was the spread of the alpha variant in the United States. We just entirely missed out. What if there were homegrown variants that would sort of compete for spread that didn't exist in the UK or France and all the other places we looked for our base rate of spread? And so, it's one thing to make a good forecast, but I think it was Balk and Devlin who said a lot of it is also just learning from your past forecasts. If you're just learning in the moment and not going back to reflect, I think you're probably leaving at least 30% or 40% of learning on the table. And I don't think we let ourselves get away with that.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I agree. I think it goes back to holding ourselves accountable also. Like you can't just have a really crappy forecast out on the internet and not at least address it or go back and try and explain it. So I think that was definitely good for us.
So then, after Metaculous Mondays, we've launched this very podcast, the Global Guessing Weekly Podcast, um, which in large part was named because it is shorthand for GGWP, which, if you have not put that together, is for gamers. That means good game, well played. And I have.
People are losing their minds right now. They're like, I've been listening for
Like,
a
I
year and I
finally
had no
realized.
clue. Exactly.
I'm pretty sure when I proposed the name for the podcast, I think I worked backwards from the acronym to the name for
As
this
you tend
one.
to do.
And for this one, we've had 20, 21 episodes. I think our interview with Regina Joseph, we're sort of retroactively counting as a Global Guessing Weekly podcast because we never did a follow-up interview series, and we just
Right.
sort of kept going with Global Guessing Weekly podcast. And we've did so 20 to 21 different interviews across this series. It's been pretty wild, huh?
Yeah. This is a fun one to think about because I remember, first reaching out to Regina, getting to know her sort of as the first person that we really met in the forecasting space. And she was incredible to us. She taught us a bunch. The fact that a year later we're still in communication and she shares our stuff on LinkedIn. And it's been I think that speaks to the forecasting community in general, just the relationships that you make and the people you meet, they really do stick around. Because as you said, it is a very small community. So yeah, to go from that first, transcribed written interview with Regina to having her come back on the show with Pavel and um, just to see where human forest has gone over that time and how we've been able to think about some of the aspects of human forest and our own sort of forecasting ideation. Like, it's just been a really great experience. And it feels like, we could have done a lot more, and I think we will do a lot more, like interviews, that is, and talking to people. And that's really exciting for me.
Yeah, I do think, and we'll talk about this once we talk about like how our content has shifted. I think, the Global Guessing Weekly podcast was really great to connect with this community and meet a lot of people and have these conversations about forecasting. I think the weakness is that it was also sort of very unstructured in terms of what the podcast was about, which we sort of rectified with the second podcast that we decided to release. And I think we originally wanted this one to be a bi-weekly podcast, which would have made our original content schedule very hectic. And this was The Right Side of Maybe. And I think I'll let you share sort of your thoughts on this, but I just want to say that, this podcast was not just me and you, but also our good friend, Mikhail Dubrowski. He is very involved in the forecasting community. He came up with the name for this podcast. He's been very instrumental in getting guests for The Right Side of Maybe and the Global Guessing Weekly podcast. And in many ways, my favorite part about The Right Side of Maybe was really getting to build a friendship with Mikhail. I really do think of him as a friend. I think he's wonderful and does great things for the forecasting space. And so, I think that for me was probably my favorite part about The Right Side of Maybe. I definitely had a favorite episode, which we'll get to shortly. But, and obviously we learn interesting things about the space. But for me, it was sort of that like meta level part about The Right Side of Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it was the first time that we had somebody from outside of the global guessing brand, us, to sort of come in and affirm what we were doing and show interest in what we were doing and contribute to what we were doing, which I think is great. And I was working with Mikhail. He's totally just heads down, like, puts in so much work, is always thinking about this stuff, always hitting you up with random thoughts and messages. Like, I think that he is sort of like the exemplar of a lot of the people that we've been able to meet in this community who are just completely enveloped in this world. I think that was great for us to see and us to be around and to rub off on us. Um, and also, I mean, the guests that he was able to help us get and the people that we're talking to now, it's been really, really fruitful. Yeah, Mikhail's great. And I think the podcast and the concept has a ton of legs. And I think
It's very focused.
yeah, it's focused. And I think when you're listening to an episode, you have some sense of what you're going to be hearing about or what sort of value you're going to get from it. And I think that's always great, both for us talking about, the things that we talk about on the podcast, and also for the listener. Um, so yeah, no, I really enjoyed the right side of maybe. I think that was a great series to start, and I'm excited to continue.
And now we get to sort of the last two pieces of content that we've done on global guessing. And these are sort of global guessing adjacent, which is the This Week in Geopolitics podcast that we did live with our good friend Ross from AR Global Security, as well as Crowd Money, which you can find at crowdmoney.io, which is our real money prediction market newsletter and podcast. Um, I think we'll sort of keep our thoughts on these two brief, but we did 13 episodes live of This Week in Geopolitics. And what I really liked about that is it really forced me to pay attention to what was going on in geopolitics, because if you're going to hop onto a live podcast where you can't like edit what you're going to say, you better know what you're talking about. Otherwise, you're going to make a big old fool of yourself publicly.
Yeah,
Which I think in some ways in part
we
led
might have still
to
done it.
we definitely made some bad calls on that. I think when
uh,
the Afghanistan first thing, I was like, they're going to hold the provincial capitals for a while, which
yeah, we
was
had no
very
clue.
wrong. I think they held them for like six minutes. Not exactly, but
Brief.
just about. Brief period of time. I think for me, Twig was really great just to, get to know Ross, really sort of keep up to date about, live geopolitics and sort of think about, and I try to do this on the podcast, was how can we take the news of the geopolitics from this week and then use a forecasting mindset to think about where it goes next and what kind of questions we might ask about the news. Because I do think, that's a really great place for forecasting, but as we found out on the show, it's pretty difficult to do that. And so I think having that practice, I think for me, made it easier to think about how do I process news and then think about a forecast that we can then follow that news into the future. And then I think with crowd money, which we'll talk more about later, I've really liked, because I think prediction markets are just real money prediction markets are just a really interesting application of this idea of forecasting. They're a really interesting news source, I find. If you go on Twitter, people are now talking about, it seems like Jerome Powell is going to be renominated to the Fed. But if you were looking at prediction markets or prediction polls, it's like, man, people could have told you that 2, 3, 4 months ago. The
Mm-hmm.
news is sort of just catching on. And so here's this great news source. And, also, if you're a good forecaster, it's a great opportunity to generate some good alpha. So yeah, what about you for Twig and Crowd Money?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I've missed from college, from undergrad, is big big forum conversations about geopolitics, like in class, talking with people about different things going on in the world. And I got that sense when we were doing live podcasts, because people were asking questions and there was engagement. And so I think we definitely want to explore more live content in the future in some way, just because I think that was a really great way to have those discussions. And so, like, instead of sort of just talking to people, we're talking with people. And yeah, as you said, great to meet Ross, and um, just make more connections in the UK scene. Obviously, over there right now, so maybe you'll be able to see him at some point. Um, but yeah, no, that was really great, and obviously, AR Global Security is doing really well, and we might work with them, again at some point in the future. Um, but yeah, just a really positive experience. And then crowd money has been really fascinating, I think, because prediction markets in themselves were sort of a tangential space to forecasting that we sort of leaned into. And now that we're there, we're seeing so many other tangential spaces, be it crypto, NFTs, people in finance. You think about markets a lot. Like, there's so many, it's all really connected. And that's something that's exciting and daunting, but just really fascinating, honestly, is like, I think part of our thesis going into this, right, was that everybody forecasts. Forecasting is something that is, industry agnostic. It's something that everybody does, and that's why, we wanted to apply it to geopolitics. And I think that thesis is being borne out in what we're seeing, because it seems like the act of forecasting is manifesting itself in different ways everywhere, and that's really great. And I think uh, being able to bring sort of the academic literature, the interesting interviews that we've done over our time to people that are just now finding forecasting is going to be extremely valuable. So
Yeah, I
I'm
mean,
excited
you
for
made
wherever
the
it can go.
yeah, you made such a great point about like humans have just like always forecasted, just a throwback to where this global guessing journey has taken us. We met someone who said, even from like the beginning of the human species, right? Like people would make a forecast in terms of where to go hunt, right? Like what direction are you going? What signals are you inputting from your environment? And then you're making a decision to spend your limited calories and resources to go hunting. And like throughout almost in like every sort of day-to-day action we forecasted. And I think prediction markets, while they've been around for a while, right? In trade, predict it, all of that. This seems to be like a new step in terms of where prediction markets are going, whether it's on the crypto side with Polymarket or reality cards or hedgehog markets, or on the fiat side with Kalshi, the CFTC regulated prediction market. It's just very new, and I think it's great to sort of be in this space now because we can kind of really learn and become experts in this field and have really novel things to say that, builds upon a lot of what we've done at Global Guessing. I think if you're interested to see in how forecasting applies to these real money prediction markets, I think our upcoming Crowd Money cast, the podcast that we do, the first section of that should be very interesting for you. And so I think that's been really great. So yeah, I think now, Andrew, it's time for us to go over Metaculous Mondays, The Right Side of Maybe, and the Global Guessing Weekly podcast, and we're each going to give our favorite piece of content that we've done. If it was a podcast and you were one of our guests and you were not selected, we probably still love the podcast, but we only had to pick one. We can't pick everyone. Everyone cannot be our favorite. We're not going to say parents, who's your favorite kid? You all are. This is our podcast, so we're going to have to make some selections here.
Yeah.
So I'll start off with, for me, Metaculous Mondays. My favorite forecast has to be the Iran nuclear deal. This was something, I think in February, that we gave this 20% likelihood the U.S. was going to rejoin the JCPOA by the end of the year. And we made that forecast in an environment where Metaculous and I believe Good Judgment and I believe Good Judgment Open as well were fairly bullish that the U.S. was going to rejoin. The media environment was making it seem like this was a top Biden administration priority, and so that they were really going to try to make it happen. And sort of, if you were to like read through the tea leaves, that this was something likely to happen. And yet, we read this great book by Marco Popic that talked about this idea of looking at constraints of a situation to determine whether or not it's likely or not to happen. And by applying that framework, we realized, sure, it might be in, people might want it to happen, but because of the constraints of the situation, it wasn't going to happen. And just to see that forecast, we shouldn't count our eggs before they hatch, or whatever the hell that saying is. There's still 2 months to go, so anything's technically possible. But it looks like we're gonna have definitely got to the right side of maybe on this question before quite a lot of people. And so I really liked it because not only did this framework sort of work, and I've been applying that framework when I look at a lot of geopolitical situations in terms of what actions people are going to take. I've now always sort of used this constraint based model when trying to look at it, rather than looking at preferences or ideology or something like that. And then I also liked it because it's a forecast that we kept coming back to. And the last Metaculous Monday that we did, we sort of flipped the question on its head and basically said, if this forecast was wrong, if our 20 or 25% after we updated it forecast ended up being on the wrong side of maybe, what would have that alternative forecast that got it right looked like? And I really like doing that sort of pre-mortem and really taking what I think is an important geopolitical question, right? What is the future of the JCPOA, Iran's nuclear ambitions, and the U.S. The U.S.'s sway and being able to, get the P5+1 to sort of deal with the situation with Iran. really sort of taking a really deep look into it. So for me, the Iran nuclear deal was my favorite. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just speak also quickly about that Iran forecast. I think, um, what interested me about the JCPOA forecast, especially in retrospect, is like if you were working off of our premise that Iran would not rejoin the JCPOA this year, then that completely changes the way that you read Iran's geopolitical maneuvers over the last 12 months, the last 10 months. And I think it's just a completely different understanding of the whole region at that point. Like, if you were to believe that they weren't going to join the JCPOA, then that says something about your forecast and about who is going to win the presidency that summer. That says something about where you think Iran's allyships are going to shift over the next few years, why they wouldn't join the JCPOA. Maybe they have better relationships with, say, Saudi Arabia. It complete just the amount of information that you can get from one forecast and what you can extrapolate from that forecast is so fascinating. And I think, especially, going back to this idea of the media, you know, even still, can the nuclear deal be saved? Are articles coming out and, US policymakers are misreading Iran on foreign policy? It feels like everybody was so far behind in their understanding of the country, you know, not just JCPOA related, but as a whole. And I think, yeah, looking at that forecast, if we worked in, civil service, or if we worked somewhere where we could actually leverage that information, I think there could have been some really interesting decisions made based off of that.
You
Um,
know, just
so that was
on
a
that
very
like
juicy
media
one.
front, you know, it's interesting. Like, and also when they talk about like, will it be revived and can they still get a deal by the end of the year? They still don't look at the constraints. It's all about, are they going to meet in Vienna again, or,
Does
is
Biden want to
Biden
rejoin?
exactly? But they're
Does
not
Raisi want to
looking. Have the
rejoin?
constraints that have been preventing them reaching a deal so far, have they changed? And that never comes in, or at least I haven't seen it generally been, whether that's in like mainstream like news like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, or even in places like foreign affairs or foreign policy, where you would hope that that's something that they're looking at.
Yeah. But yeah, going to my favorite Metaculous Monday forecast that we did, I have to say it was the Suez Canal crisis. I think, one, it was just such a wild time, as both of us are on Twitter pretty often, seeing the tweets going around about the Suez Canal crisis and keeping up with the very uh, what ended up being very fast moving sort of incident was really fun, sort of day by day checking out where's the ship, how are things
Hour by
going.
hour.
Yeah, that was fascinating. And I think it was also fascinating because, we were hearing these stories about ships that were turning around and going around the Horn of Africa and doing all these, wild detours. So clearly this was a very high impact sort of event as well, which I think is always interesting to forecast. And there's a lot riding on them. And then also because,
Billions in trade, right?
yeah, there are, so one, it had, right, the financial impact. It also has a lot of geopolitical impact as well. There's a lot of countries that care about the Suez Canal, but also there are people whose jobs, are to think about shipping and logistics. And you saw, random individuals making really accurate forecasts on Twitter about what was going to happen with no shipping experience whatsoever. And I felt like that was very much in line with what Phil Tetlock preaches about how industry experts aren't necessarily better at understanding these issues than just people who are good forecasters. Um, and we were looking at some pretty esoteric sort of factors. We were looking at the tides and, weather and climate and sand dredging and stuff that I never thought I'd be, looking at open source data of ships. And, I think we found that one really good website about tides at different times. And it was wild, so that was just like a fun one. And then, of course, at the end, after we'd finished writing and actually stayed up a long time writing that piece, trying to get it out really quickly, it'd been announced that the ship was already freed, which, I think our hearts dropped for probably like 10 minutes. But as you said offline, I was proud of us for still putting it out and talking through our thought process. Even though we might not have been sort of as accurate as we would have liked, just because, again, I think we were demonstrating integrity and holding true to the idea of being accountable to ourselves and to our readers. So I think that was a very enjoyable forecast.
Yeah, that was a really fun one. I think I do remember that one. I was on vacation for that one. I decided to take time off work and go on a ski trip, and it was like the night that I arrived, and we had like stayed up really late getting done this forecast. And I'm like, this is great. I love this. We're on vacation, but I'm feeling the Suez Canal forecast is a really big issue. And then we finish our forecast, write the article, and then it's like the ship's been freed, and it's like, oh no. I think the issue we made on that one is sort of similar to what we did with the alpha variant spread, which is we were like looking at all of this news about like, and they're gonna start like bringing in helicopters to like lift the ship, to like lift the containers off the
Yeah,
top,
I
and then if
remember that.
they make the boat light enough, they can do this. But we forgot that they're announcing all of that because that's what's gonna happen if like the current things that they're doing fail. It's not
Hmm.
because that they've failed yet. And so I think we sort of updated a little too strongly based on that news, which was, just another really good lesson that we learned. And I'm equally glad that, we easily could have changed our forecast. Like, here's what we would have forecast. And look, it would have been so correct. Aren't we
Yeah,
geniuses? But we didn't, because otherwise I don't think we would have learned the same lessons because we wouldn't have had that forecast out there.
I think also like that idea of upright being Bayesian forecasters and updating your forecast a lot. For updating your forecast looks very different when you're dealing with a matter of days versus a matter of weeks or a matter of months. And so understanding, you know, how often should you be updating, and maybe it's not even at the same clip as, if it's a month long forecast and you're updating every week, right? Maybe four times. Maybe you should only be updating two times if it's, five, maybe like the amount of actual meaningful information that can come out in that time period isn't as high as we think. I don't know, but it's just interesting to think about how certain practices change in different time periods. Something to think about moving forward.
And then on the topic of the Suez Canal crisis, that takes us beautifully into our favorite episodes of The Right Side of Maybe. Because my favorite episode was the one with Peter Wildeford, who currently runs Rethink Priorities. And we spoke to him about his Suez Canal forecast because, unlike us, Peter was on the right side of maybe, and not only was he on the right side of maybe with his forecast, he took that forecast and made quite a lot of money on Polymarket trading on it. I think he made triple, like 300% returns. He did a lot of really interesting things, and what I liked talking about Peter in that episode was not only understanding how he reached that forecast, which was interesting, but also how he ended up trading it. It wasn't just, I think it's a 60% chance it's going to happen, so I'm going to buy shares 60% yes, but he was also sort of playing differences in the price. So if the no price was at a different number, but it still made sense from like an arbitrage perspective, he bought it. Or if he thought, oh, the price is actually too high now because of momentum, it's going to go down, he was sort of not only betting on his forecast, but also betting on what the market was going to do, which is like this whole new dimension in prediction markets. You're not necessarily just betting your forecast, you're betting on how your forecast relates to the market as a whole. Where when you're on Metaculous, the best way to climb up on the leaderboards is just to put your forecast in terms of what your beliefs are and to update it, and you don't have that sort of second level game. And so I think for me, why I really liked it was because it sort of really made this idea of prediction markets much more present in my mind. Something that we had talked about before, but we sort of kind of ignored as we got really engrossed into this idea of quantified forecasting. And that sort of episode of The Right Side of Maybe, for me, I think led the seed that led to Crowd Money.
Fascinating. Yeah, no, that was a good one. And again, another person from the forecasting community that we've stayed in touch with and still talk with. And um, you know, there's a period, and I think we're still planning on doing this, but if there's a forecasting question that comes up, we'll at Peter or at some of these people that we've talked to on podcasts. So yeah, he's a really smart guy. And it was a great interview. I think my favorite, it's tough, but I think my favorite was the interview that we did with Juan Cambero. Um, And I think it was for a few reasons. One, we got to cover a bunch of forecasts, which is always fun. We focused on one where he was wrong, which I think is something that we tried to do with our own forecasting, as you talked about with Metaculous Monday. So I think that was really interesting. And then also just the breadth of topics of the forecast that we covered. I think it was one on mortgage interest rates, one on US COVID deaths, and one on the Tokyo Summer Olympics. Like those are three completely different issues. But the fact that there was able to be this common thread of forecasting between all of them, and that even, not just forecasting, but certain approaches might have been similar between all three of these questions, like, um, or sets of questions, I think that was really interesting. And I think really highlighted, uh, again, going back to this idea that like forecasting is not specific to any one area of focus or study. Like everybody can benefit from having, a better understanding of how to deal with uncertainty and think through the future. So that was just really interesting. And also having Juan still be a student and have this background, I think also spoke to the fact that anybody can really forecast or get into forecasting as long as you're willing to put in some time and energy to get better at it.
And it was nice that all three forecasts were, high impact, relevant to, the world forecasts as well. I really like that episode, and I think Juan is a phenomenal follow on Twitter as well. Just the way in which, like, he still applies this forecasting, mindset to understand public health and the pandemic, I think was just really strong. Which takes us finally to this podcast and what our favorite episodes were, besides this one, obviously. Andrew, what was your favorite Global Guessing weekly podcast?
Yeah, I'd say my favorite, and again, it's close, but must have been our one with Michael Hilliard from the Red Line podcast. Um, we both studied international relations, in college. I think that's something I've been missing is like just those roundtable or lunchtime discussions with people about what's going on in the world. And that's what it felt like chatting with him. Like he's such a friendly guy, but he has such a deep, well of knowledge about a lot of different issues in the geopolitical world. And so being able to hear from him and learn from him and also, bounce questions off of him and, understand his background. And it was just, I think, a really interesting conversation. We ended up having him on This Week in Geopolitics as well. And he came on super short notice, but he was happy to, just come chat with you, Ross, and myself. Um, that was just really fun. And then I think also, even before Global Guessing, just being a geopolitics fan, I listened to the Red Line podcast all the time. And so to be able to then speak to the man behind the podcast, the voice I've been hearing for so long, and actually get to engage and get his thoughts was a really cool experience. And I think, that wouldn't have happened without everybody that listens to this podcast and reads our articles and supports Global Guessing. That was like just a really cool thing, to meet somebody that you've looked up to. What about
And
you?
I assume that part of that had to do with the fact that you stole Michael's mic check. Isn't that right?
His mic check is brilliant, and if you haven't heard it, I'm not gonna say it now. You have to go back and listen. Oh, I guess nobody would actually know
It
because it
wouldn't.
always
No one
happens.
listened to it.
Okay.
I guess you'll just
Well,
have to
no,
have Michael on your podcast. It's kind of just like it's like an inside
yeah,
thing, you know.
yeah.
I don't
No,
want to
yeah,
spoil that.
exactly. I don't want to spoil his thing.
Just come on our podcast, and when I ask Andrew, is his microphone working, he will do it, and he'll do it twice because he usually forgets exactly how it goes the first time, and then he gets it right.
Yeah, or I just forget to do it altogether. But yeah,
Well, speaking about having people on the show that you're big fans of, I think that takes me to my favorite Global Guessing Weekly podcast, which
there's some
has to be
fanboys.
which has to be the Satapa and Saliakov episode that we did on the bin model of forecasting, because, as I've said numerous times, writtenly and on this podcast, that is my favorite academic paper of this past year. This bin model of forecasting, which relates to bias, information, and noise, as just a way to understanding sort of sources of forecasting error, I just thought was just a really well done paper and just a really great way to understand forecasts and understand, what goes wrong and how to improve them. And a lot of really interesting insights that come out from the paper, and just being able to sort of like dive into them on the podcast for me was just really interesting. Again, being away from graduate school, I didn't really have that sort of same engagement with academic papers over the last year, and finding this paper that I really like, and then being able to not only dive deep into the paper, but dive deep into the paper with the people that wrote the paper, was really interesting. And I think the bin model of forecasting paper, if you're into forecasting, or if you have a forecasting platform and want to find the best way to aggregate forecasts, I think it is required reading. I just really like that episode for that reason.
I think uh, I think that episode happened, or at least we were reading the paper while I was in Miami, actually. So I remember having to, the fact that it was able to keep my attention and that I was able to get through. I think there were two papers actually, get through two papers um, and be actually like interested in thinking through a lot of these things that we were reading about and how they applied to our past forecasts and how we're going to use this to sort of think about how we can improve our forecasting process. I think that was a big thing at first, was like, what is the process here? Like every time we were doing one of these elections, it felt very ad hoc in terms of how we were approaching them. And so having some sort of framework to think about forecasting is super valuable. And the fact that it was fascinating all the way down to Miami, I think even speaks to the quality of the writing and the quality of the ideas.
So that was our year of global guessing, which just leaves us to what we thought about that year and what the next year of global guessing is like. I don't know about you, Andrew, but I think like I've only become more bullish on this idea of having quantified forecasts, and using forecasting as a way to, not only think about the future, but sort of process the present. If you open up the New York Times, it seems like every news story fundamentally changes the economy, or the US's approach to the Middle East or something else. But then if you think but very, very, very rarely do we read that article and then think, "Oh my God, I have to update my forecast about X, Y, and Z." Um, and I think especially just like in this world where there's just so much noise of news, like it's just such a useful tool to have in terms of filtering your noise so you can have more accurate forecasts, and have less error when you're trying to think about the world. And um, I definitely want to keep forecasting, and I think it's just really strong. And you know, I really think prediction markets are a great application, but as the literature says, and I just think common sense will tell you, like there's some things that just prediction markets probably aren't the best thing to do. Like if you're trying to think about something that'll happen a year out, 2 years out, 5 years out, or is like very niche, it's going to be hard to make a market about that, either because you don't want to lock people's capital up for that long, or there's not enough people who know enough to feel confident put their money on the line. And so, just having these quantified forecasts separate from prediction markets, I think is still just really important, something that I want to keep doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of going off of that, you think about like where do we really see forecasting in the mainstream? And it's probably like weather and polling for elections,
Hmm.
And I think in those two areas, they do seem sort of, very narrow, but in those two areas, there's a lot of people relying on those. Like during election season, polling is a big deal. It's on TV, newspapers. People are talking about how certain candidates are polling. And for the weather, I mean, obviously, we care about weather forecasts every day. And I think that, what we've seen is that when there is good, reliable data, like people do want to use it to think about future events. Now I think prediction markets and Metaculous getting bigger. I think this idea that these markets can produce reliable information is being demonstrated. And I think we're also seeing a shift to relying on it as, a source of information. I think if it'd be interesting to look at like the number of backlinks to predict it, between like from during 2020 and then 2021. Because I think we'd
Hmm.
see a pretty big uptick. A lot more news articles I've seen are linking to prediction markets now as information inputs, whether it's for mayoral elections or just different things happening in the world. So yeah, no, I think we got in at a great time because we were able to meet a lot of really interesting people that might be a little bit busier these days, and not able to talk as much. And I think, uh, the world is showing us that forecasting is only going to get bigger, and get more support financially and from people, from users.
So that I think takes us to where we're headed with global guessing. I think we really accomplished what we set out to do. We made these public forecasts. We spoke with so many smart and interesting people. If you were a guest on this podcast or the right side of maybe, thank you. We really liked talking with you, getting to know you, and learning from you. And that's been phenomenal. But I think we've learned um, a few things about our content. So, I think I'll first give my thoughts on like our three main staples, and I'm curious to hear yours, and then we'll talk about our plans for the future. So, I think for me, I really liked, as I said, doing Metaculous Mondays. But for me, the issue with Metaculous Mondays was always trying to find another question.
Mhm.
Like the first
Another
eight
good question.
volumes, exactly. Like obviously on Metaculous, you can find another question. There are tons of questions, and on Good Judgment Open, there's a lot of questions. But finding those high impact questions that relate to the news or relate to different countries, foreign policy and geopolitical posture got challenging after a while, and I think that made the series sort of more challenging to do. And so I think and spoiler alert, will end up like leading to a shift in terms of the ways in which we frame the forecasts. And then I think for the Global Guesting Weekly podcast, uh, it sort of just felt like in a limbo, that it was a little too directionalist. I like that we sort of had these like wide range of guests on, but what we were trying to get out of the guest was always different, and there wasn't necessarily like a unifying theme. And I feel like as a piece of content, as a listener, you kind of want to have that, which I feel like we sort of fell short on. And then the right side of maybe I thought was phenomenal, but in terms of how we originally ideated the idea of the right side of maybe was find a particular forecaster who had one or two forecasts that they got to the right side of maybe on that they had quantified and stated elsewhere. And that leads to a very sort of narrow group, because a lot of the times, it's not just about one forecast. I think when we had Tom Liptay on talking about the forecasts that he got right, he kept making the point that it's still just not about the one forecast. It's about the suite of forecasts, the mindset. And so I think that sort of had to have been expanded. And then on like crowd money, which is not one of the three pieces of content, but that's where my mind just went. I think we've done really well in terms of that. It's focused, but still broad enough. There's clearly like a unifying theme across crowd money and the crowd money cast, but also enough sort of latitude to, I think have fresh ideas into the next year and beyond there. What about you on these? How would you sort of critique or just your thoughts on those four pieces of content?
Yeah, I mean, I think for Metaculous Monday, um, one of my main takeaways is that I feel like the updates were more valuable than the actual predictions themselves. I think, you can make a ton of, day one predictions and just leave them, and whatever happens happens. But I think that process of us going back and updating and, diving deeper into the thought process behind why we made the initial forecast and how those thoughts have changed, I think those are super valuable. um, and I think, with what we have planned, and we'll get into it in a little bit, I think that will sort of leverage the updating part of the forecast in a way that'll be really valuable and interesting, to read and keep up with and to write for us. So I think, taking our written content in that direction, I think people should be excited. For the right side of maybe, again, so like similar to what you said, it was really interesting talking to people about their forecasts. But as we've said, today and in the past, forecasting is very much industry agnostic. Everybody does it. And so I think, it makes sense for us to sort of broaden the scope and the mandate of the podcast to really embody that idea that everybody forecasts, and everybody can be on the right side of maybe in their own way. And so I think, the sorts of guests that we have lined up and that we want to have come on the show going into 2022 are going to very much, I think, illustrate that, which I'm excited about, sort of taking forecasting outside of maybe the more esoteric sort of public health and, you know, Metaculous zone and take it out into the broader world is very exciting. And for GGWP, I think you mentioned this earlier, really interesting listening and talking to people. But I think, as you said, maybe lack some of the direction that would have made it a bit more solid. And so, I'm excited to sort of hone our focus and to create some more, um, just like coherent podcast content in 2022. But still talk to a lot of the same great people who will hopefully want to come back on the show at some point. So, yeah, those were all really great learning experiences for us. And I think also, like, in general, brand building is iterative. You don't just want to keep doing something for the sake of doing something. You want to keep updating. We're basically taking a Bayesian approach to, our own content. Like, keep updating, keep understanding what works, what doesn't work. I think it's smart. And then for crowd money, yeah, I think it's gone really well so far. Um, the amount of feedback that we've gotten on crowd money and on our other content has been really great. And I think there's a lot of really exciting projects that we have with crowd money coming out over the next year. So that'll be definitely a fun one to keep up with. I think prediction markets are blowing up right now.
So, as we said at the start of this podcast, spoiler alert. No, not spoiler alert, because we're at the spoiler now. We are planning to sunset the Global Guessing weekly podcast. This will be the last episode for now. I can definitely see a future where we bring back this sort of weekly conversational podcast, but I think for two reasons it has to be sunset for now. One is that sort of lack of direction. It's sort of the Global Guessing Weekly sort of sits between like a conversational podcast and like an interview. And so I think if we do bring it back, it should probably be a much more conversational podcast. But I'm not entirely sure in that direction. And I think we should reflect before making any decisions. But then also just, given where we both currently are in life, we want to make sure that every piece of content is value add and high quality. And I just don't think that we can necessarily reliably keep that up and do good stuff with crowd money and do what we want to do with the other pieces of global guessing content. And so for that reason, it makes sense to say au revoir. I think that's goodbye in French.
Au revoir.
To the phenomenal acronym of GGWP for right now. But that does not mean that we're done with podcasts. As Andrew just said, a lot of what we've done on this Global Guessing Weekly podcast will live on in the right side of maybe. In part because of the name, which I think is phenomenal. Thank you, Mikal. But also because of the focus. I think the right side of maybe as a forecasting podcast makes the most sense. Part of my criticism that, focusing on one or two forecasts, that's a restriction that we are going to lift when it comes to the right side of maybe. But also, as Andrew was saying, it's not just people that necessarily wrote out a quantified forecast, but people who used forecasting to achieve success in their domain. I think, Andrew, privately, you made the example of like poker players or chess players, for instance, right? They are forecasting as they are doing what they do and leads to their success, but they might not conceptualize it in necessarily the same way. But I think there's a lot that forecasters can learn from them, and so we want to bring them on the show, but still have that directed focus of it's about forecasting, but more so about the skills of a good forecaster, someone who's able to take in a lot of signals and determine signal versus noise, and then use that to create an output that makes them successful.
A military general that, had to take intel and make a decision out in the field of battle. You know what I mean? A CEO that maybe pivoted his company towards digital pre-pandemic because he saw certain signs and it ended up paying off. Like, as you said, everybody is thinking through uncertainties, thinking about the future, and understanding, how to approach the future in different ways. And so I think we can definitely leverage that and have very interesting conversations with, as you said, forecasting is that common thread, but sort of getting exposure to a wider array of people.
And then that takes us to Metaculous Mondays, which will also be sunsetted. Not yet. We still want to put out one more Metaculous Mondays before 2022, where we sort of give a final update to all of our currently open forecasts. Um, Obviously, those will end up changing over times, but I think it'll be important because it's been 4 months since we've updated those forecasts, just to go back and sort of say what's changed and give like the final update for the Global Guessing Weeklies. I mean, not for Global Guessing Weeklies. Oh my God, from Metaculous Mondays. But that does not mean that we're done forecasting. Like I said, the JCPOA was like a very important forecast, and we wanted to do these high impact ones. And Andrew, as you were saying, it's in many ways the updates that are the most interesting part. And so as we enter 2022, if you go to like the Eurasia group, or probably Foreign Affairs does it, or a lot of different places, they talk about what the top geopolitical risks are for a year. And we want to take a quantified forecasting approach. So what are the top 5 geopolitical risks of 2022? And what are the forecasts associated with them? Perhaps some questions related to them will already exist on Metaculous, but I think a lot of them we'll create ourselves and host on Metaculous. And sort of how can we look at geopolitical risks and track them through the lens of quantified forecasts? That doesn't mean that, the 5 that we pick at the start of 2022 and roll out in January will be the only forecast we do. If an ever given crisis, the boat crisis, the Suez Canal crisis, much easier, or an Afghanistan withdrawal. If there's like a major geopolitical event that happens, we'll then probably spin up a forecast about that as well. But I think we want to sort of test out this idea of using quantified forecasts to understand the geopolitical space over the span of a year.
Yeah, I think that's right. We don't have that list ready just yet. We're still looking at the last year and trying to process and understand. I think similar to forecasting, a lot of how we arrive at these 5 top geopolitical risks will be based on looking at the past and trying to understand what sort of reference classes we can use to think about risks and what's how to prioritize them. But I think that'll be a really interesting one to keep up to date with, and really interesting to update. And maybe will open us up into some interesting new avenues that we don't even see coming yet, depending on what those risks are in terms of conversations we might have or places we might travel, or who knows. I'm excited to dig into that over the next month, getting ready for 2022.
Yep, and we'll have to think about a name for the updates. Maybe the updates will still be Metaculous Mondays, so it won't entirely be sunset.
Metaculous.
We'll
Yeah,
see. Yeah,
we'll
'cause they will be
see.
hosted on Metaculous. We'll have to
Less
see,
work
but
for us.
but the essence of it will fundamentally shift, and I do think for the better.
Yep.
Um, and then it's sort of the last thing is sort of building out crowd money and having it sort of keep growing, but also having, I think, all of these pieces of content be very high impact. I think the right side of maybe when it comes back January of 2022 probably won't be a weekly podcast like the Global Guessing Weekly. I think it'll be bi-weekly. Not only will that make it easier for us to record these interviews, but then also have transcripts for interviews. That's a very requested feature from us. But, if it's a weekly podcast, this is not our full-time job, so we don't necessarily have the resources to do that. But if we shift the right side of maybe to becoming a bi-weekly podcast, or I think bi-weekly makes the most sense. We'll have the resources to put up a transcript for the podcast, and so just making the right side of maybe very high value, these geopolitical forecasts high value, and sort of updating as the news comes in, and then having crowd money growing deeper, and then, as we go, just sort of connecting the themes from global guessing into crowd money, because I do think there is a harmony between these two, and sort of starting to build a bridge between the prediction market world and the quantified forecasting world will be, one of our important tasks of 2022.
I will also say we talked a lot about forecasting and news. I think it'll be really interesting if we can have our top 5 geopolitical risk forecasts, like the updates, public, and people can go to them when they see news articles on the front page of the Wall Street Journal and New York Times that are probably going to be covering at least one of these risks, and they'll be able to say, well, the New York Times said X about China, but the global guessing, top 5 geopolitical risks, is saying something different. How should we understand or reconcile that? I think it'll be an interesting check on mainstream media. So I'm excited to see how our forecast, relates to what the news is saying. It'll be an interesting thing to follow.
Well, Andrew, it's been a year of global guessing. Well, 51 weeks of global guessing.
51 weeks.
Gotta be exact. I don't want anyone correcting
Accuracy,
us.
that's what we're doing here.
It's all about accuracy. Got to get the
Yeah.
prior score right on these numbers here. What an incredible journey. I am very grateful to be doing this content with you.
Yeah, I wanna get all
I think we've talked
sentimental,
about this. Got to get all sentimental. I mean, come on. It's
but
your
no,
global guessing, man.
I agree. I know a little bit.
I mean,
Yeah,
like
no, it's
we
been
started
great.
this because, for our listeners out there, Andrew and I have been best friends since second grade, and we ended up going to university in the same city. But, since then, work and life are very busy, and it's been truly amazing to get to, spend all this time with you through a common purpose and task. It's been phenomenal.
Yeah, I agree. And especially, we started this November 2020. It's been a year. The pandemic was still raging on, when we started this. And there were definitely some very lonely nights where I was very grateful to be able to hop on the phone and not only stay up till 2 a.m. working on global guessing, but also, playing chess and just catching up and, um, you know, just being able to spend time with you on the phone. So, and then the fact that we got to see each other in New Mexico and you came to New York. I mean, it's been a really good time. So yeah, I'm very appreciative for the last year to you and obviously to people that it's weird to think that people listen to this podcast and like keep up with it and care enough to send us feedback over email about things we could do differently like that. That's a really good feeling to go from this being sort of a hobby to something that people actually are invested in. So I'm excited to see it keep growing over the next year and keep working on it.
Yeah, it was crazy when I went to the Scott Alexander meetup in London. Uh, when I was talking about prediction markets and forecasting, I brought up global guessing, and someone's like, "Wait, I've heard of global guessing." I'm like, "Oh my god, someone that's watched the podcast and
That's
read the
not our
forecast." And
family or
yeah, it's like,
friends. Yeah,
no, it's not like my mom or like my neighbor, who
exactly. It's
both
a
of
real
them
person.
phenomenal job with the open rates. I mean,
Oh, your mom's
100%,
such a good supporter. Retweets and
incredible.
everything. Yeah.
But people that have no connection to read the content, like it, and appreciate it. Um, it's been phenomenal. And you teased a meetup in New Mexico, which we never touched on, but that'll be a story for another day. We'll have to
Oh
keep
yeah.
people
Keep them on the edge of their seats. Yeah, we'll get into
on
that at
the
some point.
edge of their saddles. I think it might be a better
That's a good one.
analogy.
It's a really good one. Exactly.
Well, everyone, you will see one more piece of content from Global Guessing before 2022, which will be the final Metaculous Mondays as we know it. And then come January 2022, Global Guessing is back with the right side of maybe and the top geopolitical risks of 2022 in an exciting new chapter. And I think I've heard there might be a new website redesign. We'll have to see.
Rumor has it.
Many people are saying it. Um,
Many,
um, well, everyone, thank you so much for listening to the Global Guessing Weekly podcast, for reading our forecast, sharing our content, and welcoming us into this phenomenal forecasting community. It's been great, and excited to see what year 2 and beyond brings. So, thank you so much for watching, listening, being a part of Global Guessing, and we'll see you guys in 2022.